Hi, everyone. Welcome to SGA's Civic Engagement and Social Action Series. Today's conversation is sponsored by the Student Government Association and is co-sponsored by the Office of Student Involvement. It's designed for students to learn about how they can engage in important issues that affect the world around them. The views in today's conversation are the opinion of the panelists only and do not reflect those of the university. As part of the series, we are encouraging students to register to vote. DePaul utilizes a platform called TurboVote to assist students in registering to vote no matter the state they live in. You can get registered by visiting depaul.turbovote.org. In addition to getting registered, you can receive updates and reminders regarding deadlines for all elections in your area. With that, please join me in welcoming today's guest, Dr. Johnson. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation to join you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. One of the questions that we wanted to start off with is just your experience working as a professor in DePaul.
Okay, I guess you would say that I came to being a professor sort of late in life. I received my PhD in 1995. So at that point, I was 34 years old. That was after I had done other things. I worked in government for years. For example, I worked in actually all levels of government except municipal, which is interesting since I teach urban politics. But I've worked for state government in Georgia. I've worked for county government in, the county where Atlanta sits. And then I also worked for the federal government in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. But my initial stint in government, was because as a student, a political science major, I always thought that, I could change the course of Western civilization by working in government. And then I found that it wasn't that easy, and so I decided to go back to school and get a PhD. I'd already at that point had a master's in political science. And the rest is history. I started teaching at the University of Illinois at Chicago in 1994, right before I received my PhD. And I worked there for 9 years. And I've been here at DePaul since 2003. So I've been teaching political science now for 26 years.
Ooh.
A long time. And the courses I teach are mainly about race and class. Like I mentioned, I teach urban politics. I teach a course on the politics of urban education. I teach a course on Black political organizations, poverty and public policy. I run the gamut. I'm teaching a course next quarter, a focal point course on reparations. And so all of my courses deal with some aspect of civic life, if you will.
Cool, thanks. Sorry, lagging for me. But yeah, thank you for sharing. How was your experience working in the government?
It was frustrating. I think it was just too routine for me. I thought actually that I would have a greater impact on policy development. I've worked with a couple of legislators. I think that was probably the best opportunity. When I was living in Atlanta, Georgia in the 80s, I worked as a legislative assistant for Ralph David Abernathy Jr., who was the son of Dr. Martin Luther King's right-hand man, Ralph David Abernathy Sr. And that was, the legislative aspect was a lot better, more fun, more rewarding than the actual government part. When I was working in government for the state of Georgia, I was working in the Secretary of State's office. And so what I did was assist corporations to become incorporated in Georgia. And that was routine. It's like, okay, here are the criteria by which you can incorporate a business. So that was just like mundane. Every day you did the same thing. My next job in government was working for Fulton County Office of Public Relations and Public Affairs. And what we basically did was write speeches for the county commissioners and write public service announcements. That too was kind of routine, you know. And for the federal government, I worked in policy development and policy development and research. And so I worked in an office where the people were mainly economists and political scientists, and they did write policy, but it was based on the administration. So, for example, I first started working with HUD during the administration of George H. Bush, Daddy Bush, if you will. And he was Republican. And so the policies that we wrote, they had a sort of conservative bent. Then in 1992, Clinton took office. And so the policies, the housing policies that we wrote had a more liberal bent, you know, so still there was not a lot of control. So, but it was interesting. I as a political science professor, needless to say, it helps to have actually worked in government versus looking at the work of government in purely theoretical terms.
Thanks for that. When in college did you decide that you wanted to start working in government?
Um, I actually began college as a biology major, of all things, right? My parents wanted me to become a medical doctor, and I always teased them that I gave them a doctorate, but a PhD instead of an MD. And so that was their aspiration. Neither of my parents went to college. My father never graduated from high school. He worked in the steel mill for 36 years. And so, you know, their great aspiration for my brother and I was for us to go on to college. And needless to say, they wanted, you know, us to do well. And for a lot of people, that means being something like a medical doctor or a rocket scientist. Needless to say, there are other things that you can do to have a pretty thrilling life. And so at first I was a biology major until I realized that I was going to flunk out if I did not do something that I really wanted to do myself. And since I was paying the student loans, I had to break it to my parents that if they wanted a medical doctor in the family, that they would have to go back to school because, you know, you only get one life and you can't just sort of just sort of grab onto your kid's life. So I had taken a number of political science courses and I absolutely loved political science. And so, you know, I thought all of it was really interesting. And so at that point, I was like, hey, you know, I'm going to major in political science. And then it was like working in government because I had a very sort of naive understanding of how the system worked. And so I literally thought that I would work in government and I would like change something. Um, and that's because I really, and I hope I'm not talking too much, but I've always, I think because of the family and the time that I grew up, I've always viewed my life in terms of being a change agent. I've always really had a keen sense of my ability to change something. And so, you know, in an environment where I'm just a paper pusher or just doing something that is just routine, you know, I'm not going to be happy. And so I thought that, you know, working in government would afford me that opportunity. And unfortunately, I was bored silly, you know. And so I was like, I think I'm going to go back to school, get a PhD, and teach, you know. And then I also got involved with working for non-for-profits, you know, like for instance, I did some consulting with the Urban League, the National Urban League. And for 4 years, I worked for Reverend Jesse Jackson as his national education spokesperson. And so that was like perhaps I would say teaching and working in non-for-profit civil rights organizations have really been like the highlight of my life, the place where I have felt most effective.
Thanks for sharing all of that. I know that you mentioned earlier that you're also a polling judge this election cycle.
Yeah. Well, actually, not a judge. It's sort of like when you go into the voting booth or, to a precinct, there are like three types of people there, right? You have the poll workers, and some people refer to them as like the election judge. Those are the people who kind of give you your ballot, make sure you're registered, and all of that. And then you have nonpartisan and partisan poll monitors, right? And so the partisan poll monitors, or some people call them watchers, are people who kind of make certain that their candidate or their party is getting a fair shake, that the election workers are not going to disqualify, people who may in fact be working, who may in fact be inclined to vote for their candidate or party. Whereas a nonpartisan poll worker monitor, like I will be on November 3rd, just makes certain that no one's rights are violated at the polls. This is a pivotal election, needless to say, and I'm pretty sure when it's all said and done, this will be the highest rate of voter participation ever in the United States. Needless to say, we're facing some real challenges as a society, as a world, in fact, right? With COVID and social unrest. And so there are some pretty important issues on the table. And so I decided that, the conflicts, particularly around voting, have been just so extreme. You've heard, of course, about the voter suppression and attempts to kind of dissuade people from voting, even on social media. And so I felt that it was important for me to, go through the training and understand, all of the rights pertaining to voting, to ensure that everyone that I encounter would have their rights met.
That's really nice. I worked as an election judge, I think, like in high school once. I barely remember it, but thank you for like participating and being, I think, sorry, polling judge or
No, it's either an election judge or poll worker. That's like one category. That's the category where, but the poll monitor or work or the poll. Now I'm getting confused. Poll monitor just makes certain that everything is going according to plan. Because let's say, for example, you, Alyssa, you go into the poll and they say, well, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to vote because you're not registered, right? I would step in and say, wait a minute, Illinois has on-site registration, so she should be allowed to register on site, or let's say you're registered, but they tell you, Alyssa, you can't speak English, so you can't vote. Now that would be a big violation, right? So I would step in and I would say, wait a minute, you can't do that. That is certainly against the rules. So it's just a person who is just making certain that people's rights are given to them in the voting in the precinct.
is this your first time serving as a poll
My
monitor?
very first time, and I'm kind of nervous, because this election you don't know what to expect, because people are going to be out there trying to suppress the vote.
Yeah. Um, so did it have to do with like this specific election that encouraged you to work as a poll monitor this year?
Absolutely. My attitude is this, and this is just not for this election, but for every election. My thing is, please vote, right? Because our democracy depends on the active engagement of our citizens. And so if there is a population or a group, racial group, gender, whatever, and they're not taking part in government and who becomes our representatives, then we can hardly call this a democracy. Democracy requires vigilance. And so I think that all people should vote. I don't think that, I think that when we the people, leave it up to others to vote as well as to determine who's representing us, then we, abdicate our responsibilities in a democracy and we give up our power. Now, that is not to say, though, that voting is the only way that you can be powerful. I believe in protests. As a matter of fact, I always say I love a good protest because I do think that government has its roles in the lives of people. But, as Frederick Douglass said over 160 something years ago, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so the status quo remains the status quo until people make a demand on government. Okay. And so, when you look at the various social protests that occurred this summer, it will likely lead to some sort of change, police reform. And when you look at even the civil rights movement, if you look at the women's right movement, if you look at the LGBTQIA movement, power has never conceded anything without a demand, right? And so if the people are not actively making that demand, if you're not getting what you need through the routine channels of government, then just like the revolutionaries and the American Revolutionary War, you've got to press your interest because as I said, I believe that we're here for a purpose. Needless to say, no one lives forever. As my father always says, one thing about life, no one gets out alive. And so for me, it means that we all have a purpose. And part of that purpose for all of us is making this world a little bit better than when we got here, right? I always say I've eaten from a lot of trees that I didn't plant. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to plant some trees because at some point you're out of here. And so, I don't know whether, you believe in St. Peter at the pearly gates, but at some point, you might give an account for your life. And so the question is, what have you done? Because I do believe, I guess, you would call it hope, but I have hope that our world is converging towards something better than where we are. When you look at, let's say, if you pop yourself into arbitrary date or year 1850, right? You know, for the people who lived at that moment, there was something better up ahead. And that better was the end of slavery. That better was the inclusion of women in the right to vote, let's say 19th Amendment, 1920. That better was the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1964. 65, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the inclusion of 18-year-olds in the right to vote. On and on and on. If you want to look at marriage equality, if you want to look at the rights of the differently abled, Chicano rights. We have always been in this trajectory toward doing better. And it is my hope and belief that where we are today will not be where we are tomorrow or where we are next year or where we are in 50 years when I'm long gone, right? But where we are in 50 years will be predicated upon young people like yourselves, right? And that's why it pleases me to just be on with you all today and to encourage you. You know, I was young once. I know that was 1,000 years ago. I'm 59. I was born in 1961. So just think, you know, when I was your age, um, things were a lot different. A lot of the rights that you all are enjoying right now, they came at a cost. You know, there were people protesting. I think even think of something like the end of apartheid. I remember in the '80s, really, in you know the protests that I would go to, where it would be the anti-apartheid movement. You know, and you know there were times when we felt a little depressed about the um, you know the it seemed like change was not occurring fast enough. The pace of change was just so slow. But eventually, apartheid ended, right? And so I just think that where we will be in the future is predicated upon young people like yourselves.
Definitely. So what advice, I guess, do you have for young people to get civically engaged? Especially if maybe for some young people it might be the first time.
Well, you know what? I think that if you live, you are going to be passionate about something. And I don't care whether it is environmental justice or sustainability, climate change, education. You know, as I mentioned, when I was working for Reverend Jackson, it was as his education spokesperson. So, one area of civic activism that I have been very passionate about is equal and equitable education. And I can't tell you why that is a passion of mine, but it is. I think, you know, it is education is obviously a vehicle for socioeconomic mobility, but you know, for you all, there's got to be something that you're passionate about, you know, and so you have to, you know, brighten the corner that you're in, wherever you are and whatever you're passionate about, you've got to jump in. And so that means searching for organizations that are, you know, doing something about that issue. I don't believe that change occurs singularly. You know, change always occurs in a group or as a part of an organization. So you have to join with like minded people. And so it may be a Google search to figure out who or what organization is involved in that thing that you're passionate about. Just if I could turn the tables for a second and ask you, Ari or Alyssa, you know, what is it that you're passionate about?
I feel like I'm passionate about a lot. I feel like racial justice is really important for me and like creating like equitable change within our systems. Um, I think environmental sustainability and like an intersectional approach to like solving climate change is really important for me. Um, and I think those two things are like at top priority, and I feel like they for me, they like give me a good like lens into different things because again, I think everything is intersectional. And you
Mm-hmm.
know, it's all I don't know. I appreciate like the your you talking about like protests and like collective movements because I feel like a lot of especially young people I feel like feel disheartened by like the political system and you know people have been marginalized by this system and so I feel like while electoral politics is one thing and you know we can do our part and like vote it's also I think you talked about the importance of like organizing and like
Yeah,
collectivity and so I feel like that's the most important part when it comes to civic engagement it's like what we're doing beyond the ballot box and like tackling the system holistically so I definitely really appreciate
you're
you
right. And
talking
so,
about
yeah, there are organizations that are dedicated to those very things. You know, you might want to go online and join Black Lives Matter or any other organization. But, you know, the thing that you do is going to be much more fulfilling to you if you're passionate about it. What about you, Alyssa? What are you passionate about?
A lot of things. It's hard to pinpoint one, but like to echo some of the things that Ari said, like sustainability, something else that I'm passionate about is like supporting undocumented students on campus or undocumented folks in general in our immigrant communities. And also like just justice in general. I feel like that's so big, but
Right.
definitely
Right.
really,
I mean, but so you just think about these, just those things that you all have mentioned, and particularly like something like rights for the undocumented, right? You know, I believe wholeheartedly that undocumented people will gain rights, right? But it's predicated upon us doing something. Of course, you have to vote for candidates who are in favor of a path to citizenship, right? But, if they don't, create policies like that, then you've got to join an organization that is fighting for that. I don't care what second of the day you care to mention, there is someone somewhere always fighting for change in a particular field. I can recall in 1998, I was working with, this was when I was working with Reverend Jackson, and there were some kids who were expelled for a fight at school, and they were expelled under the zero tolerance policy. So just because they were in a fight, they were expelled for 2 years. And I was just like shocked, And so Reverend Jackson sent me down to, check it out and try to figure out, well, what the hell is going on. And then as I worked on the issue and, fought to get justice for those kids, and this was a 19-second fight, mind you. Okay. A fight at a football game. Can you imagine? It ends in 2 years expulsion. Okay, so because zero tolerance. So when I began working on this issue, I found out that there were people who had been working on that issue for like 20 years. And it was just amazing to me because it was an issue that sort of presented itself to me that I felt was just horribly unfair. And it wasn't until I started doing something about it that I realized, oh my God, there are people who have been waiting for this pivotal moment to have, some sort of change occur. And it just so happened that it got the attention of, a civil rights leader. And then we were able to give it some, some media attention and this and that and the other. I mean, so it just sort of like, it just came together. But those people had been working on that for years, decades.
yeah. But that's really powerful that they spent so much time working on that cause. I mean, that just shows, I guess, persistence. And that's really inspiring as well.
And yeah, and see, I'm glad you said that word, persistence, because I think your generation, and don't worry, I'm not going to get on my soapbox and be like, oh, I'm not going to romanticize my past because I don't care what generation you in, there have been problems. But, persistence, I think a lot of times people in your generation, they want it quick. It's like, boom, just like I was talking to my niece, she's 30 years old. And she was like, oh, it doesn't matter who I vote for. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to get what I want. And my thing is, you certainly have a better opportunity to get what you want if you demand it than if you don't, if you just sit on the sidelines and do nothing, And so it's, as one of the old civil rights songs, the title was Freedom is a Constant Struggle, right? And I promise you, freedom is a constant struggle because there is going to always be powerful people who have an interest in silencing you, right? And, it could just be greed, and so there are always powerful people, powerful forces who would like you to be silent, who would like to be authoritarian over your life. And so if you capitulate and you say, well, I don't want to protest, well, I don't want to vote, guess what? They are going to have control over your life. And so persistence, just what makes that little old ant think he can move that rubber tree plant? You all probably don't even remember that song, but the answer is high hopes, and persistence.
Yeah, I always think if you don't like something, change it. But yeah,
If you don't like something, change it. And the sort of antithesis of that is, people will say, "Oh, if you don't like America, leave it." No, no, this is our country, and so if you don't like America, change it.
mhm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for joining us, and to everyone who's watching as well. I just wanted to remind everyone that SGA meets weekly on Thursdays at 6 p.m. And follow us on social media too, so that you can get updates with all the work that SGA has been doing. And please remember to vote on or before next Tuesday. We only have like a week.
Please.
So thank you, everyone, and have a nice night.
Thank you. I appreciate it.